today's World Insight with PM Wei, global free trade on the rocks. 2 cents of a former French Prime Minister who sets the record straight.
The problem of our current world, we don't work together.
And know the score between China and the U.S. from one of the most well-known names studying bilateral relations from China.
If the two leaders can interject and then can stop this kind of deterioration, I think it will be great.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, PM Wei. The program is coming to you on CGTN. We begin today's show with the ongoing first ever China International Import Expo. It's a 6-day event that's the world's window to China's burgeoning market. International businesses paid close attention to Chinese President Xi Jinping's speech at the opening ceremony, which laid down new opportunities. He said China would create a more attractive foreign investment environment by improving the law and cracking down on IPR infringements.
We protect the lawful rights and interests of foreign companies and are resolute in meting out in a law-binding manner punishment for violations of the lawful rights and interests of foreign investors, particularly IPR infringements. We will enhance the credibility and efficiency of IP examination and put in place a punitive compensation system to significantly raise the cost for offenders.
The inaugural import-themed fair came at a time when the twin threats of protectionism and unilateralism are putting a damper on global growth. On the sidelines of CIIE, I sat down with former French Prime Minister Peking de Villepin. We talked about the future of global free trade and relations between China and Europe with that big backdrop. The world is changing fast. Every time I have to knock on your door and invite your wisdom, sir. What do you make of the current discussion, if not debates, about the global trade system? And where does your country and people like you stand?
Well, as a matter of fact, as you know, there is a lot of worries about the trade system, but not only the trade system. There's a lot of worries about the financial system and the global economic issues. When you look at the report, the last report of the IMF, the preview is not so good on growth, on world growth. So I think that we are going to see very soon the consequences on world growth of the confrontation on trade. So I hope that we are going to see in the next months a better understanding of what is the global interest on trade. Of course, for Donald Trump, the last month had been used in order to win the midterms election or not to lose too much during the midterms election. But afterwards, we might see a new trend, a new mood, and maybe new possibilities of dialogue and cooperation. That's why the meeting in Shanghai, the first import Chinese expo is so important. President Xi sending messages of keeping the Chinese economy opening, keeping the Chinese economy going through reform. These are important messages, and of course, the measures, the details are going to be also very much looked into.
Mr. Prime Minister, from now until the end of this month, we're likely to see a lot of things, series of things. First of all, you got this first ever China's Import Expo, big message. Second, you got the APEC summit going on without the participation of the U.S. president this time likely. Then you got the G20 Leaders Summit with very likely a meeting between the two presidents coming from China and the United States. A big occasion, of course, is the best way to send messages, but whether big occasions will be able to solve the problems, that's another question.
You're absolutely right. For that, we need a better understanding between these countries. We need both countries to move forward and really show that there are possibilities not to go, as Donald Trump believes it, for a zero-sum game on global relations, but to a win-win strategy, which has never been the strategy of the U.S. president. So I believe that we should work in that direction. And of course, the position of Europe in the middle between the US and China is going to be quite important. Europe is facing also at the same time, you mentioned the schedule for the US and China, but the schedule, the timetable for Europe is also a very difficult one. We're going to have the Brexit in March 19 next year. We're going to have also the European elections in May 19. Two big and important challenges for Europe. And we need to see changes, broader changes in the global situation. And I think that Europe has to play its role in showing signs for dialogue, showing signs for openness, and can really be some kind in the middle, play a role in smoothing the relationship between the US and China.
Mr. Prime Minister, it's wonderful that Europe, as you said, aspired to play a role so-called in the middle. However, sometimes when it comes to principles, you just can't be in the middle.
You're right.
But on the other hand, you could always be skillful in using the ways of interacting with one another. So to you, Mr. Prime Minister, what are the principles?
The principle that should be respected is opening, more transparency, and common benefits. I believe that it could be also the interest of the US in the coming months. The interest of the US because a broken world, a world of distrust, is not good for the US economy. The US economy has been performing very, very well, but under medication. And the medication was low taxes and huge gains in the stock market. But this is not going to last long. You cannot go better only through medication. You need to go and find some good news around the world, opening new markets, new possibilities, and new perspectives. Yes. So for that, I believe that we need an understanding between the US, China, and the Europeans. And we need also to take into account the global interest of the world economy. Look how painful has been the US policy for the emerging market. On the side of the monetary system, countries like Turkey, countries like Argentina have been suffering a lot. 40% less for the currency in Argentina and in Turkey. So we need to take into account this global interest of the world economy.
But Mr. Prime Minister, you might say so. Others might argue, why should we care? After all, we are talking about us first. That's one thing. And secondly, the world is about who is the most powerful. And therefore, that is the logic of the game. And thirdly, the world logic is about you go to the one that is the most powerful and you form blocks with that. So there are different arguments, it seems, that in a way negotiate what you just said.
But this can only be a winning strategy in a short-term view, in a short-term period. The benefit of a good situation of the world economy is going to be good for everybody. If the growth is going to be less than today, next year and the year after, this is not going to be good for the US economy. The current situation of the world economy is so much intertwined, is so much interdependent, that what is bad for the world is bad for every one of us.
You might argue so, Mr. Prime Minister, once again, but others say we're already at the very beginning of an apparent Cold War. So, Mr. Prime Minister, are you being too naive? Some would wonder.
You see, you have to be optimistic and you have to look for good solutions. I think that the key is to see what works and what doesn't work. We see that protectionism is already having a translation in our daily life by less growth, less perspective, problems in jobs, problems of deficit. On the contrary, if we want to boost growth, we need to create perspective. And that's why we should stick to good ideas. Let me give you an example. The One Belt, One Road is a good idea. This is part of the diplomacy of project, where what's good for you, you want to share it with your neighbors. You will gain politically more stability, less terrorism, less Islamism. You will gain in terms of economics. You might be able to transfer technology, you might be able to contribute to more growth in those countries, Caucasia, Central Asia, and you are going to create a new mood in terms of cultural trend, because you are going to create bridges between states and culture. This is shared development.
When you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm sure you have also noticed over the past few months there have been enormous amount of debates about the Belt and Road Initiative. But what do you think, Mr. Prime Minister, the logic behind this apparent all of a sudden debates and the prospect of parties working together on the Belt and Road?
I think that of course, whenever you have a new idea and a new strategy and you want to implement it, you are facing problems, concrete problems. We need to be able to address these problems. The difficulty, for example, between European countries and China, who both are working on some of these projects, who both are part of the AIIB, is that we don't have a daily dialogue. That's why I propose to have a bureau of the One Belt, One Road in Brussels and one bureau in Beijing, in order to, on a daily basis, be able to address the issues, face the problem, choose the project, and work every day together. This is the best way to avoid misunderstanding. Of course, it's not easy. Of course, there are roadblocks along the road, but we should create the tools. What we lack are the tools. Our current monetary system is a system in which nobody takes into account the interests of the other blocks. For example, the Fed has taken the decision to increase the interest rate. We saw the consequences in the emerging country and in the rest of the world. Why don't we have a coordinated system, for example, in G3, between the Fed, the central bank, the European Central Bank, and the Central Bank of China? People meeting, anticipating, working together. The problem of our current world, we don't work together. You know, we wake up in the morning, everybody works on each side, ignoring the other. We need to create the world governance. At the end of the Second World War, we had the IMF and the World Bank. And we have not been renewing. Even the IMF is not representing the world power. Too much power in the hand of the United States, not enough in the hands of China or India. We need to have a representative system.
International trade system is a critical example of
WTO,
what you have just said.
WTO does not represent a fair world system. We need to adjust and adapt the system.
And the discussions about the WTO is dragging us to a very dangerous area. What about that? How do you see the WTO, its ways of being negotiated now vis-à-vis its mission today?
I think that there are different kinds of problems, different kinds of issues. The first one is the deliberate attempt of the US to go from a multilateral system to a system in which the US will be at the center of everything, with bilateral agreements tailor-made in the interest of the US in order to assert the dominance of the US economy. Of course, many countries are reluctant to such a system and won't be able to accept such a system in the emerging world, in Europe, here in China. So we have to keep on working on a good, organized multilateral system. But a good multilateral system is a system which needs to be more efficient than the current one. We need to have a system in order facing crisis or facing difficulty who is going to be able to find good settlements. We need a system in which the world trade is going to be more transparent. So everyone has to move. And for that, we need to show the way. And I believe today there is a very strong case in having Europe and China opening the way. You see, we are all facing difficulties with the US. Let's have Europe and China taking the lead for new ideas between Europe and China, showing that, yes, we can get more access to the Chinese market. Yes, we can have a better understanding on property rights. Yes, we can have a good agreement on some of the key sectors that might create difficulty, culture, high tech, showing that we create the tools to have a better understanding. And of course, if it is going to be a success, and it is going to be a success, we will show the way to the US that we are increasing our trade and they are losing some of their shares. So you see, what makes the difference in the world of today is the ability to win, the ability to open the way, more imagination, more goodwill, more determination.
Well, we are talking about determination, Mr. Prime Minister. Europe is at a crossroads, some say. For example, Washington would love to work with the Europeans to be able to work out certain kinds of trade mechanism and bring China to that table later. Of course, China and Europe has been interacting very critically over the past few months and years, and there could also be possibility. So the question is whether we are lack of imagination or not, that Europe will fall into the earlier format of so-called the transatlantic relationship while putting others as the minor, or Europe could take a bold step forward to make sure it could work with parties that could bring out some of the new momentum.
The main thing for Europe is to show that it is independent. We have been living for a long period of time in a moment where Europe was too dependent of the United States on economy, on security. We need to change the model because the world is changing. Today, we need to recognize the fact that, yes, the emerging countries are key actors of the world economy. This is a new reality. So you cannot trade today in the world like before. You have to recognize the changes. And today, there is a new actor in the international relation. And the actor is fear. Everybody is fearful. Fearful of the other, mistrust, misunderstanding, fear. If we let fear grow, then we are going to see more isolation, more protectionism. We are going to see more wars, and not only trade war. So we really need to be able to treat this big issue and to show that, yes, there are solutions. This is what the people of Europe are waiting. The people of Europe, they want to see that we can find solutions, efficient solutions. They had the feeling in the last decades that nothing was possible, that we were promising free trade and a better life for them. And what I have seen is difficulty in finding jobs, more debt, more deficit, and a worse future for them, for their children, than the one they had known before for them. So we need to change the pattern of the world. The same for the company. We are in a moment where it's very important to, every one of us, make our revolution. For example, too often I find out here in China, very good companies with good leadership, but not understanding well that a good deal is not only a good financial deal, but it's a good deal that is going to create jobs. And a good investment means creating jobs, having a strong vision of the future, and sharing this vision in terms of strategy. This is something people here should learn. You know, a good deal is not only a good deal for you, it's a good deal for the guy in front, and a good deal for the country in which you are going to invest. This is something that should be learned everywhere. Good money is not fast money.
Exactly.
Good money is long-term investment, strong trust, strong links, and win-win strategy.
Mr. Prime Minister, before we go, final question for you. Many say things are getting much worse before it could get a bit better. What would be your advice for those who are looking at the world very cautiously, for those who have to operate in the current system, whether it's business, organizations, and countries?
We should not be blind. If we are not going to react very strongly in the weeks and months to come, we are going to face wars. And this is not just a word. Because this is a historical trend. Whenever we enter in a phase of isolation, protectionism, and distrust, every time it ends in war. So we should avoid absolutely this. And whenever we are facing difficulties like today with the Donald Trump administration, the Brexit, protectionism, we should find a winning strategy which is going to be stronger, an alternative. And that's why I really believe that the destiny of Europe, the destiny of China, in cooperating more and better in this very moment is important, not just for us, but for the people of the world to see that we are able to work together and to find solutions to the problems of the world and to solve them. We need to invent a new future, because if we don't, then we are going to again face the worst.
With those ambitious and certainly brave words as well, Mr. Prime Minister, what a pleasure to see you here in Shanghai. All the best. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Thank you for receiving me.
Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on the program. Know the score between China and the U.S. from Peking University's Dean of International Studies right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. American voters have made their choice on which party controls the two houses of the Congress. The election results could set the tone of future trade relations between China and the United States, some say. In a recent telephone discussion between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump, Mr. Trump said U.S. companies were encouraged to take part in the CIIE being held in China. Meanwhile, the diplomatic and security dialogue between Beijing and Washington will be held on November the 9th, and all eyes are on a likely meeting between President Xi and President Trump at the next G20 meeting. So what's the real score on China-U.S. trade relations? And what about its ripple effects to the other areas of the bilateral relations? I asked those questions to Professor Jia Qingguo, the Dean of the School of International Studies from Peking University. Here is that interview. China-U.S. relations, something that you have been passionate about for 38 years. Now running into a new situation, apparently. What is your overall assessment of where we are?
I think the relationship's in trouble at the moment, especially on the U.S. side. You have all the major political forces agree that the U.S. should be tough on China. Some people want to be tough on China because they find China's development not conforming to their expectations. Yeah. They used to expect that China will become more like the U.S. In terms of freedom, democracy, and rule of law, and that sort of thing. As China becomes more open and to the outside world, and also as China adopt market practices. And then there are people who advocate for engagement with China. They were thinking that as China becomes a stakeholder in the world international system, it would have more overlapping interests with the U.S. or common interests with the U.S. And then China and the U.S. can cooperate on the basis of those interests. And these people are also somewhat disappointed. And then you have the business people, okay, who used to be the most ardent supporter of engagement policy with China. Okay. They have been complaining over the years that China's business environment has not conformed to their standards, has actually deteriorated in their view. So they have been complaining, and now they somewhat also lose faith in engagement. And of course, on top of that, you have another group, the hardline realists, okay, who subscribe to the theory of Thucydides' trap, okay, who believe that the rising power and the established power have only one way to go, that is confrontation. So all these people, for various kinds of reasons, have reached some kind of agreement, that is to get tough on China. This is bad for China-US relations.
When you heard the word adversary, enemy even, one has to point out it's not the first time. If you look at the Cold War, before China and the United States established diplomatic relations, those words being used frequently by both sides toward one another. But even out of those harsh conditions, the two countries with strategic common grounds, which they eventually be able to strike together, managed to get together. And that lasts for the past more than 40 years. You mentioned earlier the Thucydides trap. That we haven't seen from the very beginning of the diplomatic relations. This is the very first time. So, Professor, do you think that is still the main reason why we are here today?
I don't think Thucydides' trap is real in the sense that in history, every time it proves the case.
It's not.
It's not. Actually,
there are
the
certain
rise
percentage.
of the U.S. in the latter part of the 19th century was quite peaceful. And the rise of China so far has been very peaceful.
Right.
In the Chinese case, it's much more complicated.
Why?
Because China
system
claims
is
that it's different from the U.S., both in terms of values and in terms of political system and in terms of market practices. So, and also the U.S., for various kinds of reasons, has excluded China from some of its military alliances, forum of cooperation. So China feels, in a way, as an outsider. So as a result, there is always a problem of identity between the two countries.
From China's perspective, 1972, when the two countries began secretive negotiations, there seems to be very strong momentum coming from the Chinese side with the United States vis-a-vis another country, former Soviet Union. And of course now that has gone. But you could argue since the end of Cold War, the two countries have been working even more closely than they used to be. Help us to understand what could be the thing that could still bind these two countries together. Are they significant, important enough to manage to do that?
We have shared interests.
But many believe from the U.S. that it's been playing to China's favor.
It's not the case. Okay. But the problem is, when you look at it very closely, you will find that the trade imbalance is not that big. First of all, Chinese exports to the U.S. contain a lot of parts, intellectual property rights, copyrights imported from other countries, okay, including from the U.S. Because they are exported directly from China to the U.S., they are all counted in dollar terms as Chinese exports to the U.S. But actually, it's a very complicated situation. Secondly, in service trade, the U.S. enjoys a large surplus. Okay. Thirdly, a lot of people, a lot of products China exports to the U.S. are made by American-owned companies, joint ventures, in China. So they also benefit from this process.
Where is the relationship of China and the United States be in the overall map of China's own plan for the future?
In the past, I think China, like every other country, wants to take advantage of the international system by being a free rider. Okay? And China has been doing that pretty well for the past decades. And then China realizes that it has risen to a certain extent that it becomes increasingly more difficult to take a free ride, okay? Because the size of its economy has become so big. So now it runs into the problem of either, in some issues, it has to drive the bus instead of taking the free ride. Okay? So China is in the process of transition when it comes to this big thing. For the U.S., because China is the second largest economy with a lot of resources, for the U.S., the best thing it should do is to try to encourage China to help the U.S. To maintain the international order by making good use of Chinese resources. Okay? This is what the previous administrations did. And to China, probably the strategy should be to continue to take a free ride whenever it can, but at the same time, when you can't, you have to take up responsibilities. You want to taking a free ride for China is like make good use of the resources of the U.S. reduce the cost of maintaining international order. But anyway, until recently, the two countries have been working together. We had problems, but then we had basically worked together fairly well, if not very well. But then I think this pattern has been disrupted. Trump's approach on trade is so outdated,
It is.
And so heavy-handed.
Actions, reactions, interactions.
I guess if you drive in the same direction, the old driver would be happy about it. But if you drive in a different direction, then he will become mad. Yeah. And so the problem between China and the U.S. is that they need to consult with each other with regard to where they are driving the bus. We have a problem in that regard. Okay.
Now you have a very unique driver, President Donald Trump. So Professor Jia, what would be the strategy? Of course, I'm all asking this ultimate questions, but realistically, the strategy coming from China to deal with quite a character like President Donald Trump with the huge backdrop of a critical transition between China and the United States?
I guess, first of all, China should continue its effort to persuade Donald Trump and his people that it's in the U.S. interest not to confront with China. Okay? In a confrontation between China and the U.S., China certainly would suffer, and the U.S. cannot be immune of it. Secondly, I think China probably should make greater efforts to push for the reforms. In a way, this would create a better business environment in China, not only for Chinese business, but also for American business. And probably we should also make greater efforts in terms of rule of law, okay, reforms, to make sure that our legal system is more independent and better judgment and delivers good sentences according to the situation. On international issues, probably we need to promote stabilization of the East China Sea and South China Sea. I hope that we can eventually sign this Code of Conduct agreement in the East China Sea, and also manage the South China Sea issue. Well, we cannot solve it at the moment, probably in the foreseeable future. Okay? Why should we waste time and energy on these issues? Okay? So we should manage them, and then we should, work on our relationship with our neighbors and also with the U.S. So in this way, the interaction will become more positive.
Are you seeing in that direction? For example, the recent trip made by Prime Minister of Japan to China, that's quite a rare thing if you think about the recent interactions between the two countries. Are we, or is China stepping in that direction? What would that mean, opportunities for the other countries besides the United States now, for this critical juncture, for them?
The recent visit of Prime Minister Abe is one aspect of this effort. And also China has been making efforts to improve the situation in South China Sea. Okay? We have a draft agreement, and then we are trying to expedite the negotiation. And of course, in East China Sea, I think that we have some kind of a tentative agreement with regard to the certain kind of conduct to avoid unnecessary military clash. So China has made a lot of efforts in this regard. I hope that this would continue, and then we can focus on the more meaningful aspect of the relationships.
Professor Jia, if you look at the foreseeable future, short-term future, there's likely to be some interaction opportunities between China and the United States. Some suggest APEC, while President Trump said he wouldn't be there, and yet the delegation will be there. If you also look at G20, there have been media reports suggesting the two heads of states might be having an opportunity to meet, and that will be quite an occasion if they did. So what would these immediate future opportunities mean for both countries, and how should the two countries take great advantage of these rare opportunities if you look at it today?
Well, I think the earlier they meet, the better. I think it's time for the two leaders to make some important decisions to shape the relationship in a positive direction. So if the two leaders can interject and then can stop this trend of deterioration, I think it will be great.
Professor Jia Xinguo on China-U.S. relations. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.